ביאור משנה ד', the explanation for משנה ד', פרק ב' משנה ד'. משנה זה מוסיפה ללמד בעניין פסי ביראות. This Mishnah is continuing with this well story that we had before. How to make a place where you can carry. So let's sit inside and I'll explain a little bit when we need to. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, now even before Rabbi Yehuda, we need to explain something. Most of these well things used to be on the way to Yerushalayim. When people used to take their sheep and cattle and walk with them to Yerushalayim, for example, there's a holiday, so there used to be stops on the way to make sure that people can water their sheep and their cattle.
Like gas stations.
Like gas station, that's right, exactly like that. Usually you were not allowed to do that, as we're going to learn. But because of it was in Israel and you don't want the people to lose their sheep or lose their cattle, they gave a leniency to make it in such a manner that people can water their sheep and cattle during that time. Okay. So we're not talking about a regular well, because usually regular wells, if it was next to a town, it was closed with a fence, so you can carry. Yeah, you could close with a fence. Over here, it wasn't closed with a fence. That was the whole idea. But we still say we're going to be lenient so that people can do it. Okay. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer. So this is the case over here. Rabbi Yehuda says, Im hayta derech harabim mefas katan. If there was a public domain, because last Mishnah we already established that you can make it as large as you want.
Big in size as you want, but there's dimensions on the borders.
Yeah. But it can be very, very large. So the question is, what happens if it is very large, but there's a public domain that walks in between them, like a road? So what happens then? So this is the question. Im hapasim שהדרך עוברת ביניהם. So if the fence, the fence posts, it's not exactly fence, it's like posts all around, that the public domain goes through them. So it says, what you should do, yesalkena latzdadin. You should move the road out of the area. In other words, don't put a public domain inside that area. So if there's a public domain going in, right, make like a detour.
So in the United States, we have this concept, eminent domain laws, right? Would that be kind of like a variant of that? That the will gets precedent in the eminent domain?
No, because it's actually a good thinking, but it doesn't, because the whole point for the well is eminent domain, is to make it for the public. Eminent domain is when you take from the private to the public. Over here, the whole point of the well is to give the public the opportunity to do it. Because if it was a private well, as we're going to see, you should have it fenced anyway. Yeah?
So there shouldn't be...
And then the eminent domain does work. That can work also. They can take away your well completely. But that has nothing to do with us. Yeah. So what should you do? Yastalken al tzadin. You should move, you should make a detour of the public domain, of the road. Yisalek et haderech el michutz lapasim. You should take the public domain outside of the boundaries of the well. Sho'il ve'en hapasim mechitzot gmurot. That since this fence is not a real fence, it's not a real boundary, אלא היכר מחיצות בלבד, it shows on the boundary, but it's not a real boundary, it's not like a wall, That's right, it's like markers. And what makes it a fence? It will be a fence, שהרי הפרוץ מרובה בהם על העומד. With this kind of fence, you have more empty space than you do have fence. So obviously it's not a boundary. לפיכך, דרך הבתים, דרך הרבים מבטלת את היקף הספחים. Therefore, the public domain takes away the precedent of that boundary. שכן הליכת הרבים שם עושה אותה כרשות הרבים. Because the public domain walking in it makes that area like a public domain. And then if it's in a public domain, you're not allowed to carry them. So it says the easiest way is just to move the public domain, the road, out of the way, because if the road would go in it, you'll be in trouble. You're in a public domain and then you won't be able to carry.
So if Shabbos came while you were there and your caravan stopped there, you would have to build the additional things instead of being able to...
The idea is that you should do it before Shabbos. Yeah. Yeah, that's the idea. The Chachamim Umrim, so this is what Rabbi Yehuda says. The sages are going to disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. What are the sages going to say? Chachamim Umrim, the sages says, Eino tzarich, he doesn't need what? Lesalek et haderech harabim letzdadim. He doesn't need to move the public domain to the ways. In other words, he can have the public domain right over there and they can still carry. He says, how can they carry? It's a public domain. So because it says, Sho'il veyesh bekol ruach shnei pasim shel shisha shatfachim, because it says, even though it's just a signpost, it's not a real boundary, but it has some kind of measurement of 6 tfachim, haren arba mechitzot nikarot, everybody can see that you have a boundary over there. Ve'en alichat harabim benehem mevatla otam, and the public domain doesn't take away from that right to carry in that area. So the sages says, even though there's a public domain walking right inside there, we will still give you leniency to carry in it. Now we're going to see that there's distinctions between types of wells. There will be some types of wells you will be allowed to, and some types of wells you'll not be allowed to. So let's see. Echad bor harabim, we're talking about a bor, a pit of the many. Let's just tell the difference between a pit and a well. It's a big difference. A pit is, they used to dig big holes and they used to wait for the rain and they used to make like a passageway from the rain, like a runoff into this pit. So that every time it rains, this big hole will fill up with water and then you can have a supply of water throughout the year from that well. That's called a pit. Besides that, there's a well. What's the difference between a pit and a well? A pit, once the water comes out of it, it's not going to have more water coming in. A well, you can take out the water from inside in a well, and it's every day going to continue to have more water. So that's the difference between them. So all these rules that we discussed, Echad bor harabim, we are discussing a pit that belongs to the public, ben bor shel mayim mechunasim mashiyach larabim, whether it is a pit of water who are there for the public use, ube'er harabim, where it is a well that is there for the public use, uben be'er mayim chaim shel harabim, for the public, ube'er hayachid, and the well of the individual, this is a private well, uben be'er mayim chaim hashayach layachid. So it says like this, all the rules that we discussed is pits and wells that belongs to the public. When it comes to a pit and a well that belongs to the individual, we're going to have a disagreement. What's a disagreement? If it's a well, we're going to consider it like it belongs to the public. But if it's a pit, it doesn't come water by itself, then we're not going to consider it as a public, and we're going to see soon why. Osim lahem pasim. So the three, if it's a public domain or it's a well in the private domain, you're allowed to make not boundary. You can just mark it with mark posts, like we said. Mutar לעשות להם פסים. You can just mark it. כדי לשאוב מהם מים בשבת, להשקות שם את הבהמות, in order so you can draw water from there on Shabbat in order to water the animals. אבל לבור היחיד, but if it's an individual pit, what happens then? כיוון שאפשר שיפסקו מימיו בשבת, since it is possible that the water inside that pit is going to finish on Shabbat itself, right? And then, if there's no water in that area, all these markings means what? Nothing. And then people are going to carry without water. There's no point in it. So they said you're not allowed to.
Is that why they're that it's not finishing works on Shabbos. There's another law of Shabbos regarding works.
Yeah, but I'm not sure it's related to him.
Completion of work? No,
Yeah, that's something else. But I don't think it's related to him. So it says, "Lo ikilu bo chachamim la'asot reshut hayachid al yedei hapasim." Over here, the sages were lenient to make it into a private domain through making boundaries. Shelo etiru chachamim pasei biraot, because the sages were only lenient for these markings. Ela kedei shiyu mayim metzuim le'olei raglim lashkot behem b'matam. The leniency was for the travelers on the time of the holidays to come and feed their animals, and water the animals. V'chol zman she'en shamayim, and as long as there's not water over them, en lepasim torat mechitza. So then all these boundary markers do not hold, because the leniency is only when there's water there. Ve'asu letaltel shama, and you're not allowed to carry over there. ואילו בבור היחיד יש חשש שישכח ויטלטל שם אף בזמן שאין שמיים. And in a private pit, there's a worry that the guy is going to forget. He's going to see the boundary, and he's going to forget, and he's going to carry. What about a pit that belongs to the public? You have the same problem. Once the water is out of there, people are going to carry. So how come they allowed it? אין עושים לו פסים. So you know what to say. So it says in the public, there's a difference. Why is there a difference in public? Since it belongs to the public, somebody is going to remind you not to carry because there's no water. Because many people use it. But if it belongs to an individual, you might forget. That's the idea. So what do you do with an individual pit? עושים לו מחיצה גבוהה 10 טפחים. You are forced to make a proper fence. A fence that at least 10 טפחים tall. היינו מחיצה שלמים מסביב לבור. You have to make a מחיצה around the pit. This is דברי רבי עקיבא. All this, what we just discussed, are the words of רבי עקיבא. ואף על פי שגם בבור הרבים אפשר שיפסקו המים, and even though that also in the pool, in the pit of the public, it's possible that the water is going to stop, מכל מקום סובר רבי עקיבא, nevertheless, רבי עקיבא thinks, שמותר לעשות בו פסים, that you're allowed to make in it just a boundary, just a mark post. לפי שבזמן שאין שמיים, because at the time that there's no water there, מזכירים הם זה לזה שאסור לטלטל שם. They remind one another, you're not allowed to carry over there. But if it's a private one, there's no one to remind you. הואיל ורבים מצויים שם, since there's many who are found over there. רבי יהודה בן בבא אומר, רבי יהודה, the son of Baba, says, אין עושים פסים אלא לבאר הרבים בלבד. He says, everything you said, I disagree. The only lenient, usually you should make a fence. The only lenience I can see not making a fence is only if you have a well for the public. A well for the public. But if it's a pit for the public, I don't even allow them. שלא התירו פסי ביראות, אלא לבאר מים חיים של הרבים בלבד. It says that they only permitted to make the markings and not a real fence to a well of water of the many only. In other words, a well, he says, for sure we'll have water over there. Even if people take it out, there's going to be water. But a pit, there might not be water even for the public, therefore I will not allow you to carry. ולשאר, and all the rest, רב יהודה בן בבא says, לבור הרבים ולבאר היחיד, to the pit of the many, or to the well of the individual, וכל שכן לבור היחיד, how much more so, to the pit of the individual, עושים חגורה. You have to make a fence, a proper fence. You make a belt, מחיצה שלמה מסביב. You have to make a proper fence. גבוהה 10 טפחים, which is high 10 טפחים. יש מפרשים חגורה, there are those who says, why do you call it a belt? It says, היקף של חבלים. It's like we said before, you surround it with ropes. You remember the 3 ropes that are 3 altogether, the 10 טפחים in distance, and they at least 1 tefach, all 3 of them. A third third of a tefach each, 3 to make 10. Halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, and this is the halacha. The halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, that it needs to be a well, that in other words, you have to make sure there's always water over there, otherwise this doesn't work, and it's only a leniency you give to the people during the time in Israel, because they need to take their animals to the temple. ולא התירו פסי ביראות אלא בארץ ישראל, they only permitted it only in the land of Israel, לעולי רגלים לבד. And even in Israel, it's not for the entire year. It's only the time for the holidays, for that specific time. ודווקא להשקעת במתיים. And even that, you cannot use it. It's only may be used for what? For the animals. But if a person wants to take from it, he's not allowed to. So if you want to drink, what do you need to do? You need to jump into the pit, to be in the private domain, and drink there. You're not allowed to take it out of the pit, because then you're taking it from a private to the rest. So it's only a leniency for the animals. It's not a leniency for the human.
I've been in West Virginia, and most of the homemade wells I know, if you jump in those, you're not.
I know. Also in Israel, which means you won't be able to use them for yourself.
You're not coming back.
I know. אבל אדם יורד לתוך הבוער, but a person needs to go into the well, ושותה and drinks, ואסור לו לדלות ממנה ולשתות, but he's not allowed to draw out of it and drink, אלא אם כן עשויה סביבה מחיצה מקפת גבוהה 10 טפחים. Only if he makes a proper boundary around the well, then he will be allowed to drink there. ברם, אם הייתה הבערך רחבה הרבה שאין אדם יכול לרד בה, but if it was the type of pit that you discussed before, that if you go in, you're not going to go out, מותר אף לאדם לדלות ממנה ולשתות בין הפסים. It says in such a manner that those wells, that there's no way that you can get in it because there's no way to get out, then they will allow you to drink from it if you're really thirsty. But then it's again, the allowment is only in the land of Israel, only during the time of regel, and usually it's only for the animals, not for you, but if you need it and you really can't, then you can use it.
It doesn't even